Oscar and Lucy, Chapter 2, continued. Although Frederick Bartlett's studies were interesting and thought-provoking, they were, after all, only psychological experiments. Surely memory in reality, what we tend to call the real world, is more stable, more reliable. After all, we rely on it in the legal process. What lawyers and policemen call evidence often boils down to what somebody remembers. Surely, if you do your best to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, surely if you add, "So help me God," as some are wont to do, the truth will emerge. Well, truth's a tricky thing. Pilate, you may recall, asked about it at the trial of Jesus, and then didn't hang around for an answer. As luck would have it, in 1972, a trial far less significant than that of Jesus gave psychologists the chance they'd been waiting for to examine the question in detail. I'm referring to the doings of the famous committee of the US Senate set up to look into the burglary at the Watergate Center and the subsequent cover-up of that event by the White House staff. President Nixon had been re-elected, but the belief that he'd been personally implicated in this skullduggery would not go away. The Watergate hearings effectively sealed his fate. Bit by bit, the testimony of those present, their memories of meetings and conversations, formed itself into a coherent picture. Slowly, Tricky Dicky's goose was cooked. The key witness in this affair was a man called John Dean, the former counsel to the president. His evidence was a chronicle of encounters with Nixon stretching back many years. In particular, what Dean remembered of conversations involving John Mitchell and Robert Haldeman helped bring a president down. Dean's memory was phenomenal. Senators commented on the clarity and consistency of his recall. He was even jokingly referred to as a human tape recorder, which became hardly a joke at all when, not long afterwards, it emerged that the meetings and conversations had in fact been secretly recorded, all of them, by the president himself. With Nixon's reputation in tatters and with the office of president mired in disgrace, the news that these tapes existed was greeted with a mixture of disbelief and bemusement. Obviously, prosecutors wanted them. Obviously, after due process, they would get them. Commentators publicly speculated on the former president's vanity. It seemed foolhardy to the point of madness to have kept such damaging testimony. Why on earth hadn't the guy destroyed them when he had the chance? Yet oddly enough, it was the president himself who arranged for publication of the transcripts, even wrote a foreword, which amounted to the claim that Dean's memory of events had been entirely false. For people in my profession, it fell to the cognitive psychologist Ulrich Neisser to carry out the necessary analysis, finally published in 1981 as John Dean's Memory, a Case Study, a classic of cognitive psychology. Like all clever ideas, it was obvious when you thought about it. Take a particular event and compare Dean's memory for what was said with what actually was said. It's something that can be done word by word, a curiously eerie operation because it's so rare. Well, what did Neisser discover? Dean's fabled memory for detail was simply that, a fable. He was virtually always wrong about detail. Crucially, he was wrong on legally significant points of detail that the senators had pursued, whether the president himself had actually uttered particular words or merely allowed them to be said in his presence. You can see why Nixon felt the record would vindicate him. He never did quite say any of the things Dean alleged. Dean's memory was wrong. Worse than that, his memory was equally bad when you came to the gist of things. More often than not, he distorted the gist of a conversation, exaggerating his own rile, and sometimes even inventing a role for himself where none existed. In a nutshell, you could not use Dean's memory of events to recover anything like the truth of what went on. At pretty well all levels, what he remembered was quite manifestly false. People didn't say what he recalled them saying. People didn't do what he said they did, and so on. So was Dean a liar? So was the president innocent after all? Fortunately, this is a chapter about memory, so I will finesse those questions. Dean, in my opinion, was no more a liar than anybody else, and that includes me and you. He believed he was telling the truth. Alas, he also believed, as do I and you, that he had preserved a record of the past when all he had preserved was a record of his past. As Freud might have put it, John Dean's testimony related to John Dean. His memories didn't emerge like a stack of file cards. They were formed, to use Freud's term, by the circumstance of the Watergate hearings. Circumstances that included the fact that he believed, along with most people, that President Nixon was guilty. According to Neisser, Dean was, I quote, fundamentally right about what had happened, despite the fact that his testimony was almost invariably wrong. Imagine you're in the jury at a trial, and the judge sums up, "Nothing the key witness has said has proved to be correct, and we have irrefutable evidence of that, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Nothing he said can be substantiated by references to that record. Indeed, the defence has described it as a pack of lies, and it is hard to quarrel with that. Nothing he said was true. Nothing, save his manifest and sincere belief in the guilt of the prisoner." Well, would you feel a little awkward? Would you wriggle slightly? Which does rather put the spotlight on Ulrich Neisser. Having demonstrated that Dean told the truth about virtually nothing, it's interesting to see how Neisser squares this with the claim that he was accurate as to the fact of Nixon's complicity in a crime. He poses the question in a disarming way. I quote, "Given the numerous errors in his reports of conversations, what did he tell the truth about?" I must say, the answer is a bit strange. We're told John Dean did not misrepresent the truth that Nixon was guilty because in the course of numerous encounters with the president, he'd formed a clear view as to his complicity. He didn't misrepresent this knowledge. He just dramatized it, using narrative processes which, as we have seen, are the very stuff of memory. In that respect, he was consistent, even accurate. We are to believe his consistency reflected a deeper truth, independent of the particularities, the details. Stripped of the fancy words, what Neisser is saying is that Dean told a good story, a story that grew out of innumerable encounters with a seriously delinquent president, a story that resonated because we too knew it to be true. I'll hurry past that last bit. So the president's hopes that Dean's testimony would be undermined because it was wrong in both gist and detail, virtually all the detail, mind you, were doomed, because at another level, for want of a better term, what we might call the level of God's truth, what Dean had said was accurate. Neisser ends his paper saying this about Dean. I quote, "His mind was not a tape recorder, but he certainly received the message that was being given." I don't know about you, but I find that conclusion quite scary. I'm not lighting any candles for Richard Nixon, you understand, but I find the idea of what I might call justified falsehood rather disturbing, because it's barely a step away from the unjustified kind. Indeed, because it can lead to all kinds of perverse consequences. I fully accept that personal memories are creations, personal fictions, making up the sustaining web of my identity. Equally, I can accept that shared memories are often negotiated fictions, the stories we tell each other, the stories we mutually inhabit. I can accept the difference between memory and belief. It barely bears scrutiny and dissolves on inspection. All this I can accept, but I worry nonetheless. I worry about certainty. I worry about conviction. I worry that one can still ask the question, what is truth? You may judge I'm getting to the point at long last, but first let me remind you I'm telling a story, and a story must make sense. This particular story will make my sense, not necessarily yours. And since it will be as much about me as about Oscar, I run the same risks as John Dean. Just bear that in mind. Well, am I going to explain exactly how Proust's Madeleine cake had that extraordinary effect? Am I going to tell you about Oscar? Soon, I promise. But let me tell you another story first. 20 years ago or more, I was in a queue at a conference lunch break, inching my way along with my tray the way you do at these things. I was late. There was nothing much I fancied, apart from some nice-looking bits of battered fish. Only a few pieces were left. It's always that way. Indeed, by the time I was within range, there were only 2 pieces left in the tray. The man in front of me, I confess a rival of mine, took one, hesitated, glanced briefly down at my shoes in a shifty sort of way, and took the last piece as well. Sounds familiar? I suppose so. Now, don't you go believing the circumstantial detail, not after everything I've said, but at least accept that the Battle of the Fish took place. I ruminate on it often, I suppose because I lost. Now, speed forward to just the other day. I pulled into an underground car park. It was completely full. I made the usual myopic circuit in the semi-dark and was about to leave when a car started to inch its way out of its bay, the way they do, the telltale exhaust steaming in an encouraging way. I stopped, waiting to take the place, only too aware I was blocking those behind me. My waiting was observed, and the moving car crept slowly back into its bay, and there it stayed, immobile, while the occupant lit a cigarette. And suddenly, like Proust, I was 1,000 miles away, inching my way towards those last bits of fish.